My name is Fred Cook, and I drive school bus.
My name is Leanne Murchie, and I'm a school bus driver for TCAPS. It's been a very wonderful experience.
When I first hired in, one of the previous bus drivers told me that this particular job, driving school bus, is the best job on earth. So I immediately took to it, and I have to agree that this is one of the best jobs that anyone can do.
What prompted me in the very beginning, I have a college degree, and she said, "You're in the safest vehicle in the world on the road." So I thought, well, I'm going to try. Because I would be on the same time schedule as my own children. And when they were off, I was off. When holidays, I was there. So it was the best of both worlds. TCAPS offers jobs elsewhere within the system.
Between routes, I used to, for 12, 13 years, I did lunch duty over at East Middle School, and now I paint.
They're real good about finding people the hours that they need during the course of the day to make the job great. We have Mesa Insurance. The whole district has it. It's awesome. It's the best health insurance. We offer a 401k. There's a sign-on bonus. It's a win-win situation.
The most important thing, I think, coming to work at TCAPS is you understand that you are part of a team. It's a part of a collective. It's not just bus drivers and then versus teachers. It's not that. We all are in this thing called education together.
If a person likes kids, generally likes kids, this is a perfect job.
So I'm talking to kids all day, and that experience is really heartwarming, and I continue to understand what it means to be a part of the community.
You are an educator. You have a chance to touch children's lives every day. And don't think that you don't. You are such an important part of the wheel of education.
Thank you for attending. Viewers may watch Board of Education meetings and board committee meetings live on TV 190 or online at tcaps.net/board. Recorded meetings may be viewed on demand at the same address. Doesn't appear as though we have any public comment. So just informational, the committee will be adding an additional item for review under item 3C. This item is the Traverse City Central High School band trip to Italy, March 17th through 24th, 2025. Details for the committee to review have been placed in front of you. This item will be placed on the agenda as item 3C4. All right. Procedural items. The committee meeting minutes for November 27th. Any changes? None. They're going to stand as posted. Next item is the district course catalog. No updates this month.
Correct. No updates this month.
And then moving on to the field trip request.
Yeah, so the field trips are pretty standard, ones that we've taken before. So we have our first robotics team, the 2 trips for both the middle schools to Washington, D.C., and then the band trips for both high schools to Italy. So all of the details, other than the one from today, they do. You should have those in your packet as well.
Yep.
So one thing I want to add to this is a thought, and I just want some feedback from 2 board members that are here. So, one of the things, and Josie has brought this up a couple times, and I tend to agree. We got a little bit of an issue, and I would say that it's just a social norm kind of now thing that's different, is a lot of our trips, we have students bunk together, if you will. Okay, so a lot of times they'll get a hotel room with two queen beds, right? And you've got 4 kids in a room and 2 in one bed, 2 in another. And I know of situations where kids have not wanted to do that, and one has slept on a floor, with no blankets, or that, and so it definitely is an issue. And so I've been kind of going back and forth trying to figure out, what it is. The problem you run into is, you can say, well, we can offer somebody their own room. But my issue with that is a kid that can't afford that, so you're giving kids that have the means to do that and the kids that don't have the means to do that to not have an option, which I struggle with big time. So really the only thing that I've come up with that I think I'm heading is, as a district, buying like 5 to 10 air mattresses and making that as an option that a student can take one of those air mattresses with them. And they can bring their own pillows and blankets at that point if they want a separate bed to sleep in, that they have that option and that it's readily available at all of our secondary buildings that take in-state and out-of-state trips. Just looking for feedback and thoughts from you guys on that.
It would add to baggage if they're flying.
I get it.
And, I read over that thing to the Washington, D.C. trip, and they say everything had to be carry-on. They don't want to do any bag checking. And I think that might be an issue.
I'm going to have some things to work through with groups, from that standpoint of that I may have to set a budget up to cover a $30 deal in a certain situation, or that they submit a form and go through a process if they want it. I think that there's a need for it.
What about, can they bring their own sleeping bag?
Could, but again, you're still on the floor, and so that's going to be an option because they're going to need to bring their own sleeping bag or blanket or pillow. I just don't love the idea of a kid sleeping on the floor, And you could go with the smaller single blow up air mattress that maybe could be rolled up and put in a backpack. Maybe that's an option. I haven't, we've talked a lot about this, but I haven't fully the logistics of it figured out completely yet. But,
'Cause I think you could run into some of the hygiene issues too with recycling of even an air mattress, but I could be wrong.
they're relatively inexpensive, you know, and so if I went through a few of them, I think I'd be okay. You know, but I don't, like I said, I don't have a perfect answer for this.
Right,
but
and is the option at hotels anymore to get an extra bed?
it's
They're-
highly unreliable.
Yeah,
And you know, I don't want to circumvent more than like the occupants per room. You know, if you're supposed to have 4 in a room, this isn't that you now get 5 in a room. You know, by having an air mattress or whatever, it's just allowing a student that didn't want that sleeping in a bed an option beyond sleeping on the floor and maybe not have pillows and blanket. You know, and a lot of times students, my understanding of when they do these, a lot of times students choose who they room with and different things. But like I said, I feel strongly that I do not want a situation where if a student's not comfortable in that element, for us not to have an option, and the only option B is, well, if you can afford it, you can have your own room or your own bed. You know,
Right.
that to me is not the option that I'm completely looking for either. It's not like a sleeping bag or a single air mattress on the floor is a great thing over a bed. So I don't know that many kids will take that option over the other. But it's something that we're gonna have to grapple with, and I'm gonna have to have some options. And so
They may just have to discuss that as part of your talk on the trip.
right.
It's not like bringing your own home.
No.
Yeah.
No, it's not. But like I say, we're going to have some kind of option, and this is the cheapest. You know, otherwise it's mandating everybody have single beds, and you're going to cost twice the cost of trips.
Right.
You know, but there is a reality here. We're seeing different things that are playing out across the country, lawsuits, you know, of sexual harassment, different things. We've seen it with Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, lawsuits all over the country in tents, you know, and so, like I said, we're going to need to come up with some kind of option here, and that's the most inexpensive, you know, $30, like you say, for luggage, or let's say it's there and back 60. You know, maybe I ask advisors just to go and buy some when they get there, you know, and then donate them. You know, I don't know. I'm like I said, but I just want to kind of let you guys know that I'm grappling with this with our team, trying to really look at that. I think we're going to have to come up with something as an option, you know, that a student identifies before a trip or something, you know, that we have to do.
So that was my next question so this is going to be something that's going to be planned out. The student's going to know that you're going to be sleeping on an air mattress.
And again, it's their choice, you know,
Right.
rather than the double bed kind of, you know, concept.
Right,
or the
and
queen.
and you're right. We usually allow the kids to sign up for who they want to room with, but it's the last room, and you know those are the people that you're
Yeah.
students that you're dealing with that they weren't
Yeah.
picked to be in
Right.
a room.
Yeah. So like I said, I just know that relatively quick I'm going to have to, and we may pilot something. We may have to, you know, it might not be perfect and try and figure it out for a year or whatever and work ourselves through it. But
Yeah.
just know that this is something that's been brought up by a board member, and I have seen some things across the country that do worry me in the aspect, and that we're going to have to, at the same point, I don't want this to be a barrier to where a group just says we can't afford to take a trip,
Right.
you know, either. So, you know, that's,
I think in the States, I like the idea of you getting there to the destination and the chaperones going out and purchasing,
yeah.
because that's probably, then that alleviates the carry-on and the extra charge for that.
It would probably be cheaper to buy one and donate it, you know, to a local, you know, Salvation Army or some
Right.
group like that than it would be to pay the baggage fee back and forth. Unless the single ones. The single ones, you know, are in a kind of a smaller box that I think you can deflate, wrap up, and may fit in a backpack, you know, carry-on aspect. But like I say, I kind of gonna have to figure this out and give some discretion to some advisors. But you know, in signups, we're gonna have to have something that if you elect this, you need to pre-choose so that they know from that aspect, you know,
Yeah.
where that's at. So.
Well, I think it's good that we're getting ahead of this and, talking about it, and if that's our option.
Yeah,
that's the
yeah.
option.
So I'll keep you updated on it, but I just want to acknowledge that, you know, it is something we've been discussing, and something as these trips go through that I'm going to have the principals have some discussion with trip advisors and such, and that, You may hear about me mandating something, you know, but again, it's something that I'll make sure is not a barrier to the club or anything from that standpoint financially, you know, to be able to do the trip. So,
Right.
Okay.
Okay. Anything else on the trips?
Yeah. I see it's West Robotics, First Robotics. Does that include students from Central? Would there be an opportunity for Central? Do they go?
They just haven't submitted their field trip request form yet.
They probably
Yep.
will.
So
Yeah.
they'll do the same.
Yep, they're just ahead of the game.
Okay. And
Yes, thank you. So we can just move these field trips to the consent calendar for our next board meeting. Moving on to informational items. Our board curriculum learning series, curriculum adoption process.
Okay.
Heidi?
So you've heard a little bit probably about this before, but we know we have new board members that probably haven't heard the full run-through of the curriculum adoption process. I know, Beth, you and I have talked a little bit about it, so I thought this would be a good time to really look at what our process is when we go to adapting a new resource or material for a classroom or content area. And so the steps we use, you'll see here, we start with just preparing, we do a study around our curriculum, and I'll go through each of these individually. We make a recommendation and determine the scope. We have an implementation process that we use for piloting programs, and then we do the selection and the launch of the resource. And so in the prepare process, I thought I'd use an example because this is a relatively recent one. We just did at the end of last year an adoption for anatomy and physiology. And so in the prepare phase, I thought it would be easy to use an example that existed. So in the prepare phase, we really identify a team of leadership that's going to actually oversee the adoption. And in the anatomy and physiology example, that included any teacher that was currently teaching physiology, anatomy and physiology, as well as a teacher that had taught it in prior years. Also made sure we were including the content specialist and representation from both Central and West on both sides of town. And then the goal really there is to really articulate the goals of the why behind the purchase. And in this case, they hadn't had a new adoption in 6 years. And so they were out of their online resource. They were ready for a new book. And we also had some additional things to think about. We know in probably 1 to 2 years, they were going to do an adoption for anatomy and physiology as a possible AP course. So we had some additional work to do there. But those were all the things we took into consideration as we started the prepare phase, as well as what do we consider to be high quality instruction in science and how are they aligned to the science standards. That is phase 1 for us. So in that prepare phase, we also review that framework for vision of instruction and define the adoption conditions. So for example, when we look at defining the conditions, we talk about not only the resource that's physical, right? But also if there's any virtual resource that's available, if we have to include technology in any launch of a pilot or program. And then we also make sure we determine a timeline and milestones that we need to meet in the adoption process. So in this case, we developed a plan to prepare teachers and leaders for implementation of a new anatomy and physiology resource. And in that process, we used and developed a plan to execute and look at ed reports. Most of you in education would know that ed reports is a pretty good resource for reviewing and already doing some analysis on resources that are out there in most subject areas. And in this case, the ones that bubbled to the surface were resources by Martini, McGraw-Hill, Marib, and Visible Body. And there was also an open resource that they looked at. So in the selection, the team conducted the initial research online. So not only meet myself, but the teachers would reach out to the vendors that had the materials available. They would review ed reports. They requested examples from all vendors so they could bring in those resources and review as a team and really study the information. And also we would have presentations by the vendors. So the vendors would actually come in and do their dog and pony show, right, of evaluating and giving us their information on their particular resource. But overall, it was for us to really dig into the materials and resources that are available for anatomy and physiology. One part of it also comes really at, I would say this comes a little further on, and sometimes we revisit this. And I put this in here because contacting other districts and experts that have used the current resource is a good way to examine and see if there has been some success that takes place. Because when we think about a pilot, if you go into a pilot with a resource material, a lot of times, number one, they tell you not to look at the data solely for your conclusions about the product, because there's a learning curve, there's professional development that goes into it. And so a lot of times we look at other districts that have incorporated or included that and adopted that into their curriculum to see how it actually has worked. And in the case of science, we actually go a little bit further, and I put in here, and Megan, I don't know if you can click on that document. So with science, we use the EQUIP rubric for lessons and units in science. It's aligned to the NGSS science standards, and also gives us a guide to look at and review. So this is in there for you to look at, but if you scroll down, one of the leaders that was looking at and reviewing the adoption for anatomy and physiology, if you keep going down, looked at all those different areas and then used this rubric and identified what they felt was high quality or where it met the standards. So if you keep scrolling down a little bit more, a part of the review, you'll see they looked at lessons and unit criteria, they looked at the evidence that was in there to support, and then they looked at and made a determination on the evidence of quality. Was it adequate? Was it extensive? Was it inadequate? And then made some suggestions. So as they started to review the resources that were available, each of the teachers took one of the resources and really did an evaluation, and then they came together and looked at it. So you'll see we use that EQUIP rubric. It's super helpful in determining where the gaps might be, because we know for sure that no matter what curriculum resource we adopt, there's always going to be some sort of gaps there that we need to fill. At one particular program is never perfect. And so we use this, number one, to identify the ones that look to have the most potential to be successful. And then number two, we look at what might be possible gaps that we might need to fill if we do an adoption of that material. So Megan, if you go back to the other. And so that's really just an overview of that gap analysis that we used in science for that EQUIP rubric. And those were done on each of the resource adoptions that we were going to look at. All right. And then after we're done looking, in this case in anatomy and physiology, after we were done looking at the resource, we made a recommendation. So we examined all the evidence, looked at, really compared strengths, gaps, analyzed feedback from stakeholders. So teachers really had a really good dialogue. We had 2 half days that we actually pulled them from school. We had good conversations about what made sense, what didn't, according to high quality visions of instruction and how it aligns to our science standards. And then we also used, like I said, to make that final decision process, we used that EQUIP rubric for the 4 areas that were evaluated. Beth, I think you had a chance to look at the adopted resources, which was the fundamentals of anatomy and physiology. And then what we also take time to do is make sure when we're going through the steps, we're communicating that out at department meetings. Because even though the teachers that were currently teaching anatomy and physiology, we want to make sure that any decision in science is also communicated out with those departments. So the book was brought there, the selection choice, it was communicated out to the science teachers, and just to make sure they were in the loop on the plan of the adoption for anatomy and physiology. And then on here, we have the plan for procurement and distribution of the resource for materials, and that relates to what you're gonna hear a little bit about next, which is kind of that pilot process. And this was, in a adoption like this, anatomy and physiology is relatively easy, right? There's a low number of teachers that are using the resources, and so we were able to give them all the resources from the vendors to actually look at and review. So that is helpful when you're going through a pilot process, so they can sample the materials from the different vendors and kind of see how they think that plays into their curriculum, and then have good discussions. And then the next step we use is really determining the scope, which is where we map out what that pilot will look like. Who will pilot, how many classrooms, teachers, and grade levels, which is what I was talking about. An adoption like anatomy and physiology is much more easy to handle than when you're adopting a full ELA curriculum for elementary school, right?
Or math.
Yep, or math for that example. But if you're looking at it, you always have to think about grade levels, teachers. You also have to think about timing. We have had quite a few conversations about the number of professional development, how we're tiering our implementation processes so that our elementary teachers in particular that have multiple subjects to teach are not inundated with lots of new resources and curriculum adoptions happening at one time. So we try to make sure that on our curriculum adoption map that those are staggered, and try to support teachers in that way. Once the committee has a full picture of the scope and field test, then we develop a collection tool. So basically, it's a rubric on how that material is actually, resource is actually performing. So as they do their pilot process, we think about student voice, we think about assessment, we think about all the pieces of the curriculum in that rubric and assessment tool that the teachers will use when examining that fully in their pilot mode. And then during implementation mode, we create really ongoing professional learning plan that includes getting to know the materials, the resources, and sustained professional learning. This actually has been a really big push for us over the last 2 years. Like, when we're developing or implementing a new curriculum resource or material, we want to make sure we're doing all the pieces planned well, right? Are we providing professional learning that the teachers need in the adoption of the new resources? Do we make sure we have a short-term plan, right? Because they're going to get high dose in the beginning, right, of professional learning. And then how do we create a long-term plan for sustainability and activities to support that implementation throughout? Because so often you'll see you get a bunch of materials and there's lots of training in the first year. And then after that, that can taper off. And so what we've really been trying to do with our professional learning team is look at all the areas where we need professional learning and figure out how those actually fit into the puzzle to provide sustained professional learning. And I think at our last meeting, we really talked about that professional learning. It needs to be sustained, it needs to be consistent, it needs to be throughout the year. And so, and have a multi-year plan. Certainly in this case and in every case during an adoption, we establish feedback loops. So if it's a large curriculum adoption, certainly there's surveys and feedback that we get based on teacher input and staff input on the curriculum resource that they're piloting, to make sure we're getting consistent feedback or lots of forms of feedback from different stakeholders. And then the last piece of the puzzle is really that selection and launch of the product. And so a launch of the resource. And in this case, the final selection, it was a unanimous decision. So it was easy. So anatomy and physiology, they did all the research. One of the things that really played into our selection, and Beth, you probably noticed it when you were looking through the anatomy and physiology book, is that in 2 years, we expect that there will be an AP anatomy and physiology class. And so in selection, we, as part of our selection, as one of those extra things, we had to reach out to College Board, talk about their resources that they're currently using, talk about what might be in the hopper for options for AP anatomy and physiology, and then make our determination based on that information that we know. So we're pretty confident that if AP anatomy and physiology is on the books for College Board that were set with our resources related to that. So that was an important piece of the puzzle for us.
It was a solid book.
Yeah. Yeah, and there were 2 books with that particular adoption. There was Essentials and there was Fundamentals. And we actually selected the Fundamentals because it was very comprehensive and gave the teachers a lot more opportunity for a little bit more engagement and hands-on activities as it went through the process and options for them to use in class. So it's what we feel was a great adoption, but that's kind of the process that we went through. Once the final adoption was made, then you go into that budgeting cycle where, in fact, I should have mentioned this earlier. I always include the budget and finance, Cindy Farah, in our adoption process because she's really good at, once we know the final picture and the cost, what we think the cost might be on the product, to work with the vendor to get us the best cost that we can. She has knowledge that we don't necessarily have, right? She will know if we are doing an adoption from McGraw-Hill and we have 3 other adoptions we've done with McGraw-Hill, that gives us a little bit of leverage. So she's able to take all those pieces together and really get us the best price on those curriculum resources that we can. We also have to look at many things we take into consideration since COVID, right? So before COVID, we were quite a bit of our resources were, you had a book in class, the teacher would help create resources with that, not as much virtual or online access platforms. As you can imagine, that has changed, right? So online platforms are really a part of it. It's almost flip-flopped, and the cost to buy the package of the online access as well as the hardcover book, I think it was a $10 difference. Yeah. And so those things all come into play because we have to be conscious too that we are in a budget situation now where we've been able to use some ESSER funds to actually support our curriculum adoptions. And so when we're making adoptions, we have to think long-term about, number one, staggering when those curriculum adoptions are taking place, as well as, are we making sure that if it all went ugly, right, and we didn't have money to actually do an adoption in that year, do the teachers still have resources that they can use in the short term, right? So yes, in this case, we made sure that every classroom has classroom sets of physical books. We made sure they had a 6-year adoption of online access as well to make sure that those 2 pieces were in place. But always trying to plan ahead. Like, what do you do if we are in a budget? Because John, you can probably speak to the many budget cycles we've come to where there has been a halt and there hasn't been any spending in the area simply because the budget got really tight for just in the state for education in general. So those are all the things we take into consideration when we're doing our selection and launch. And it really is, it's a comprehensive process, right? Because as you do all these things, there's other things happening in tandem. So for example, we developed a scope and sequence for anatomy and physiology. What does that look like in the classroom? Because you know the book is this thick. What are we identifying? What are we identifying as priorities that relate to our content standards? And so we're doing the scope and sequence. We're writing those 1-pagers, those at a glance for us to have to see what those units might look like. So, and there's other things, nuances in teaching that you also look at too. Like, how are you intentionally putting engagement strategies into your teaching, that art of teaching, those instructional practices. So this is the physical, adoption process that we go through, but there's a lot more that goes on the back end that requires for preparation and launch of any curriculum adoption for our people. So if you've been through a curriculum adoption, Illinois, maybe you have, and so it's a long process, but if you do your due diligence, the teachers and the students can really benefit from that process.
It's long and thorough.
So I did not mean to death by PowerPoint you today and have you listen to me talk, but what I wanted to tell you is that first slide has a link to even our notes. Like, here's what we do when you go through a process, and it will tell you, if it's a K-5 adoption process, and here's some resources that we use. So on that first slide, when he goes talked about it, feel free to go back and take a look at those and just take some time to see, you know, all those little pieces of curriculum adoption.
I have a question, a couple questions. One is about how many teachers are teaching anatomy and physiology?
We have one on each side of town.
So 2.
Yep.
And then how about, usually with the science, you throw a lab in. Is there a lab with this?
Yes, there's labs throughout anatomy and physiology. They actually, as part of our adoption, they had a resource adoption of some technology pieces to do with anatomy and physiology. But yes, labs are certainly a part of anatomy, all of our science classes.
So lab generally throws extra costs on it, you know, because you're using things, throwing them out. You can't.
Consumables.
Yep, consumables.
Well, you do consume them. We do consume them. So I was just kind of curious, you know. I would like to talk to you at some point about that process versus when you're looking at the math or you're looking at history. I'm
You know,
very interested in that.
The interesting part of that, so we just had this conversation just before the break. So even in those subject areas, the way that textbook manufacturers have gotten slick.
Oh, yeah. I should.
And so what they do is they create a consumable packet, and it's copyrighted. Okay, so you have to use it. I consider it much like a course pack at the college.
Yeah.
Okay. The problem is from that standpoint, the kids use it and then it's done for that year, so you have to buy a new one the next year.
Well, the math book, you know, or the ELA book, you
My
have those
perspectives,
workbooks.
exactly.
And
So-
you're, you know, and I'm
It-
thinking, what a waste.
And it is, but it's what they do to, you know, kind of do it, and they've got it copyrighted, so you can't copy them,
Right.
you know. And so this is what they've done now that the digital world has gone so much. So what Heidi talked about, I've seen many times, 10 years ago, if you bought that anatomy book, it probably would have cost you $100. And
That
then
was
the
an
digital,
expensive
and then
book.
the digital copy would have been $10. Now the digital copy is $100, and for an extra $10, you can get the hardcover book. Okay, this is what they've done. And so now they've also gone to these consumable packs. So one of the worries that I have is when budget gets tight, you don't have
Never.
the money, right? You don't have the money for those consumables. I mean, when, you know, those of us that have been in the job for a while know, you know, after the last federal influx of dollars, when we had the ARRA funds, that in that preceding year, we lost a $470 per pupil cut mid-year after the budget was already passed. And so, you know, budgets were hit hard. And so now you're at a point where that going in that next year, you don't have the money to buy those consumables. So it's one of the things I've tasked our team with is to begin talking with our folks about that. Hopefully that day doesn't come. But as a historian, you know, by degree, you know, you learn from that, and let's talk about what we can do if that happens to make sure that we stay on track. And so, you know, the same we've got to think about, you know, these federal dollars did not allow us to buy things in advance. We couldn't buy consumables for the next 2 or 3 years. By the letter of the law, it wasn't allowed. They had to be spent and used, you know, no later than this, you know, this coming spring. Essentially, those dollars have to. And so we've been very smart, done everything we can. But consumables is one of my worries for future budgets across the board from that standpoint, because I'm afraid we've actually increased our consumable thing just by the way that textbook manufacturers have gone about their researches.
But I can also remember where we didn't have the consumables in classroom, you had a text. And in some cases, we didn't have a text.
Right.
My great books was totally without text.
Sure.
As
And we have
using
some of that.
Great books.
Yeah.
You know, and so the strength of your faculty then
100%.
is what you lean
100%.
on.
100%.
And it gives them opportunity to really own, if you will, the material that they're teaching. And I think there's a lot to be said for that.
There's a lot more work in that.
There
you
is,
know, in
but
preparation.
it's more fun.
Yeah, but
It
like I said,
actually is more
that's one of
fun.
the conversations we're having now, just likelihood of that rainy day coming, and that we need to be prepared to make sure that we have
Plus,
all those kind of things.
It would be like having a band class and you have a basically a textbook and it says every piece you're going to do and this is how you're going to do the piece, it would be hard to teach that because the way you connect to your subject, you know,
And you're
you
talking
want
about the art?
to choose. Yes, you would, and it is the art.
And
of
I think
teaching
that's
and
where
communication.
the scope and sequence comes in. So those teachers, even though they have adopted that resources, sit together and talk about how that's going to be used, right? Because you're not going to use the whole book, right? You
Right.
want to get those labs in.
Well, you won't get through the whole book if you,
Right.
in the time that you have.
Right.
God willing.
So we're having a
yeah.
lot of discussions on those now.
So yeah, and you'll go through different parts of the book for different kinds of students. You know, so yeah, it's kind of interesting. I really believe the good teachers are worth their weight in gold,
100%.
but you have to give them a chance to be a good teacher. A book or a consumable cannot
That's a resource.
replace.
Yeah.
Cannot.
It's a resource, I say all the time, not a curriculum.
Yeah. But it's interesting, you know. So yeah.
For sure.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, you're welcome. If you have any other questions, just holler, and
Oh, I
happy
will.
to happy to go through that with you. But I think we have a pretty good process that we use to make sure we have, you know, stakeholders included and making sure we're looking at all the different pieces we need to look at. It's hard in K through 8 because it is consumable driven from the vendors. You know, most of the resources that we have available, but we do ask those questions like, what are we going to do if you can't do another adoption?
And you can't spend bond money on consumables.
Yes, right.
Cannot. And, you know, it's not quite this simple, but bond money is pretty much bricks and mortar buses, you know, and then our operating funds that we get from the state from our per pupil is what we use for salaries, for microscopes, for books, for those kind of things.
Yep. All right, thank you. Moving on to the MDE index review.
Eating and cool.
Right, you get cooling.
Tiffany, do you want to launch it? And what would you like to do?
Go ahead, you can start it.
Okay. So the MDE every year does an index review of schools, and it includes different indicators about how schools are performing and includes several factors based on growth, proficiency, and participation. And so those scores are really included from those state tests. So MSTEP, SAT, MyAccess assessments are also included, as well as participation in the tests themselves. And so how these scores come about really are they're component and weighted in these areas. So student growth is at 34%, which is the heaviest weight. Student proficiency at 29%. School quality and student success at 14%. Graduation rate 10%. English learner progress, which ours typically don't show up because we have so few English language learners that isn't factored in.
But growing.
But growing, it is definitely growing. And general participation and English learner participation specifically. And so one of the things I put up here, because usually the biggest question usually is around what does school quality and student success mean? So that 14% is one that usually is a little bit elusive to people, and that is that component of combining the 5 subcomponents described below that you see there. So K-12 parent and students chronically absent, right? That absent. Do they have access to arts and physical education? Do they have access to a library media specialist? What advanced coursework do they have access to? What access do they have to CTE programs in their building or at a center? What post-secondary enrollment do they have? And you'll notice in there, you'll see International Baccalaureate, which we had at the lower levels many years ago. Early and middle college and dual enrollment pathways. Are we allowing them opportunities for that advanced coursework in many different pathways and solutions? So that's usually the one that people have the biggest question about, and those components create that 14% index value. The rest, and when they talk about student growth and student growth proficiency, it's are they achieving or on track for college and career readiness? And the state each year defines like what those percentages are. So when you're looking at that index growth, it's saying based on what the state says is that minimum requirement for percentage, how are your students achieving based on student growth and proficiency?
Does that come from the Department of Education?
Yes.
And so we could talk to them about whether or not they're leaning a little bit more for college or leaning a little bit more in skilled trades to kind of get an idea of what their way of calculating that is.
Yeah,
I'd
and
be
I
very
think,
interested in who to talk to.
yeah, maybe John, you might know who to talk to on that, but the quality to set in student success, that's where some of that comes into play. But when you're looking at levels of percentages on those index, I think they're thinking about all of those things because those percentages, they're not expecting you to have 100% proficiency at 100%, right? So they have that percentage calculated each year based on students. So this is our elementary snapshot, which actually looks really good for the 22-23 school year. We had a couple of schools that showed, this is their overall index score. So we had Central Grade do very well and really come up from last year's scores, and the majority of our schools either maintained or went up. So for elementary, our index scores, they did very well. And I won't dig into it, but you can click on this this picture here, and it will take you to the other. There's more detailed for the index, unless you think you want to see it. So it's up to you. Middle school experienced growth in all schools. So West Middle School, East Middle School, and Montessori. East Middle School experienced a 4.9% increase overall, West 6.67, and Montessori 4.49. And Montessori consistently remains almost at that 100th percentile. I think they were at 99%. So that is a highlight, and to see the middle schools continue on that upward trend is a great thing to see. For our high schools, CHS experienced a 0.66 increase overall, and West experienced an 18.77 increase in overall school index. This was great because if you remember last year, we reported out that they had taken a little bit of a dip, and it was based on proficiency. So number of students that, or I'm sorry, based on students showing growth, percentage of students showing growth. So this year they did in their, well, actually last year's test, they did very well, and their students actually showed significant growth. So their index came back up, which is where we typically see West Senior High. And then on the bottom, you'll see Traverse City High School, which they struggled from last year to this year. They were on an upward trend to 21, 22, and then took a dip this year. So certainly an area that we continue to work on. And it's Traverse City High School is a tough one because you have a transient population of students coming in and out. You have students that refuse to test. You have, so lots of different factors come into play when you're looking at the Traverse City High School index. But I had an opportunity to visit a couple places that have alternative education programs and looking at different ways that we might be able to help support the students better. And so I think there's some new ideas that are coming about related to alternative education and support for students that might have some merit that we need to look at to help continue to grow and see growth with those students. But Traverse City High School is a tough one because you have those kids coming in and out. Typically, there are a lot of our struggling students from high schools that have selected to go to TC High, but it's a different population of students in some cases that requires different type of education. So not shocked by what we see with Traverse City High School, but certainly looking to improve what we see there. And then the last, what was it? So I think, yes, now we're on to celebration and success. So
Any questions? Any questions on the
Anything, well, just the drop, because that was for TC High School, that was about a 12% drop.
15% drop from last year, yes.
So just,
And we saw that in 17, 18. And so I got to go back and look at because theirs were, it's the number of students that are testing too. So like you're scored in your index on the number of students that participate in the test, and we don't drop students for non-attendance, right? So if students aren't dropped for non-attendance and they're remaining on the books and they're not there to test, that is another,
Use the
yes,
number.
yeah.
How many students do we have at?
About 150. Is that right? Is that where we're at now after the last count day? Can you check? I think we're at about
Interesting
150.
to have an N for each of those scores, so you know approximately how many
What the sample size
representatives,
is.
yeah. And a standard deviation would be very interesting.
I think it was around 150 for Traverse City High School.
But we'll
Very
take a look at
close,
that deeper.
156.
You know, this is relatively new. I mean, you know, we just kind of had this just before the holiday came out, so we've got some digging to do into that, and we will.
And if you, I can show you this last, if you just want to touch on that one, we can go ahead and, if you scroll down, this is what you can see if you hit the arrow, see where it says first page. And go to your next one. So these are additional, this is the index, so each index, the overall index, the growth index. So you can see by school, like where they had success and where they might have had struggles. So you can dig further into that on your own, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
All right. Thank you.
Yep.
All right, celebrations and successes.
Since Heidi was at this one, I'm gonna let her.
Okay. All right. So John actually was there too. So we, Andy over at Cortade started a Creative Explorers program out of some of his title funds to help support math and ELA. And this was his part to support STEM. And so the Creative Explorers really is a STEM opportunity. You'll see students coding. You saw them in the hallway all over looking at how to code using different colors to make a little vehicle go. And so it was just an excellent way for students to engage. And how many students do you think were there, John? I think
30?
Yeah.
He said there were 40 participating
Yeah.
total.
2 classrooms full. Teachers were excited, kids were excited, and I mean, if you want to see engagement, stop by the Creative Explorers program at Cortade. But this really speaks to how you can create engagement opportunities through coding and STEM, and also help support their math and science.
And those are
understanding.
Tuesday, Thursdays at 4?
Tuesdays and Thursdays at 4. Yeah. So great program, great opportunity. I took this, I was at the Shared Time, we also have a Shared Time program that, and this is a picture of Charles Taylor, and he has been a music teacher at St. Francis in Shared Time program for years and years. And so I was lucky enough to be able to have time to go see his performance, but just to celebrate some of the things that we also do for our Shared Time programming in TCAPS. It's a great partnership that we have with our private schools that allows them to offer additional students in our community opportunities to music and art and languages. So it was great to be able to see that. And then the last one is West Middle School Robotics Competition. So we had our first West Middle School out of school robotics teams, 2 of them compete. One team made it to state finals. They did not place at state finals, but for a first year out to make it to state finals is a great opportunity for them. So super excited about those celebrations, and happy for the new year. Oh, one more. Oh yeah, instructional rounds. You were at this one too. So instructional rounds, Central hosted, if you remember when we talk about the big 5 areas that we're targeting, one is instructional rounds and how we're looking at high quality instruction that's happening within the classroom. So Kristen and I both had a great opportunity to attend instructional rounds. I was able to actually stay for the whole day for rounds, which brought a team of people from different schools into classrooms. And Flanoy, maybe you participated when you were teaching in rounds. You probably did.
Yes.
Yeah. And we're able to visit classrooms and then look at feedback from what we're actually seeing from basically people who don't know very much about your school, right? And identify areas of growth and areas of strength. So Brian Gwinney, assistant principal at Central led this. He did a fabulous job. He did an excellent job making sure we had a schedule, a timeline. We were all able to get into 3 rooms and then come back as a team and actually gather that feedback for his team. I particularly love the way he did this because if you notice, we wrote some of our feedback on the whiteboards. And that allowed that information to stay up for the staff to come do walkthroughs for that to stay up and have them see what that feedback was from that instructional rounds team. So it was excellent day, excellent job. So super proud.
Are you using
of
this
their
as a model for the rest of the district?
Yes, it is the model. It's consistent. So no matter where you go, you should see the same thing, whether it's at Career Tech, whether it's at Central, whether it's at another school. It's the same process that really focuses on improving instruction in the classroom and as a building as a whole.
Right. I know a lot of teachers are glad that we're getting back into instructional
They are.
rounds.
We have, I can't tell you how much positive feedback we've had on this so far. And, you know, our strategy this time is not to shove it down people's throats, right? It's to, when you're ready to opt in, our goal is by the end of next year to have all schools have at least done 1 instructional rounds visit, so.
And the other thing that I'm talking, my fiscal frugality, is, you know, one of the things that led to it going away was it was very dependent on subs and, you know, the financial aspects of it. So I've been kind of preaching from the beginning, like if we, you know, and we're in a situation now we don't have the extra subs. So we have to look at different ways. Can we partner with other schools so when we have our PD days and they have school, that maybe we can, you know, share? Or, you know, are there ways for us to look at video, maybe to be able to do some of this and be able to look at? So, you know, we're consistently trying to look at ways to make sure that this doesn't have the fate that it had last time. You know, when we go back and look at our data from staff, from our strategic plan and other pieces of survey that we've done, that was one of the things they felt like it was a great initiative and just boom, was thrown away.
Right.
You know, and so how can we make sure these things that we do are sustainable regardless of the finances, you know, as we move forward again. Hopefully doom and gloom doesn't come, but you know, I as we are approaching the end of the federal money, it's really important to me that I can continue to preach these kind of things, like how do we make sure as we build this that it doesn't suffer the same fate as it did last time.
Right.
And Kristen had some good ideas about this, about looking at how we could engage, because these instructional rounds are on specific days. How we can engage community members, maybe business members, and use them, see if they want to volunteer as a sub during those days for instructional rounds. So we're not taxing our subsystem, but making good connections for community members to see great things that are happening in the classroom, as well as allow us to move forward with instructional rounds. So a couple things we're working on. So if that does happen, we have a backup plan.
Looking at just different ways.
All right. Okay. Anything else? Any other items to cover? All right, so it looks like right now our next curriculum committee meeting is Monday, January 29th, 8:30 a.m. here in this room. And that will be also kind of depending on what gets voted on at the organizational meeting next week. Okay, I think we are adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.